Scott Lucas is a professor of international politics over at Birmingham University. He joins us now from the UK. Professor Lucas, always a pleasure having you on. All right, so on the one hand, you have the United States saying, at least for the time being, they're still entertaining the idea of joining the JCPOA, re-entering the deal. We all know that Israel has long opposed this deal from the very beginning. It is not part of these negotiations. What type of assurances do you think that Israel is looking for when Mossad's chief and Benny Gantz are there? And what type of assurances is Washington ready to give?
So to get to the core of this, let's look at two things. The first is this type of chest thumping, that there are military plans if Iran pursues a nuclear weapon, is not new. Israel did this before the 2015 nuclear agreement. The Americans have talked about contingency plans. Indeed, there was a briefing on contingency plans in October of the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, if Iran pursued a nuclear program, about what could be done. You know, it would be irresponsible not to have contingency plans in a worst-case option. So the escalation in some outlets today that this is a U.S.-Israeli sign of moving towards a war footing, let's dampen that down. Secondly, timing is crucial here. The fact of the matter is that with the resumption of the Iran nuclear talks last week in Vienna after 5 months, the Iranians walked back almost all the progress that was made this spring. They scrapped almost completely the compromise in which the Iranian negotiators said in June, we're closer to the end of the road. That's because it's a harder line government under Ebrahim Raisi, supported by the supreme leader. So the U.S.-Israeli message, and indeed the U.S.-European message, which is also coming out, is this isn't going to work, Iran. You need to come back to the table, seriously negotiating from where we were in June, where we had the compromise, rather than going back to square one. And the white noise about U.S. and Israeli military plans in a worst-case scenario, that sort of chest thumping reinforces the line for diplomacy rather than at this point a military strike. Okay,
we'll talk about those possible contingency plans hopefully in just a bit, but coming back to how you described Israel's attitude in terms of the chest-thumping attitude that it's displayed since 2015, what has changed since 2015 is that certain countries in the region have grown closer to Tehran. We know that officials from the UAE have visited Tehran. Saudi Arabia has displayed a closer relationship with Iran recently as well. How do you think that will play in terms of reviving this deal? Does that dynamic have any weight at all?
Well, I think it's important to note that those countries you mentioned, let's say the UAE, have actually grown closer to Israel as well in recent months. The so-called Abrahamic Accords with the UAE and Bahrain for economic and cultural links, and indeed political links. And as far as the Saudis go, they're behind that move towards developing links with Israel, even if they're not in front of it. I spoke with a Saudi official yesterday about the Saudi talks with Iran, which are going on in Baghdad. And he said very clearly, look, the talks are going on, but the Iranians are being difficult from our perspective. Don't look at this as us moving towards supporting Tehran. So, it's in the interest of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other countries, not to have a war in the region. So they're not going to be backing the Israeli military option. But at the same time, no, the Arab countries are not going to take the side of Iran over the nuclear issue.
Okay. Israel is believed to have previously targeted Iran and its nuclear facilities, whether it's the assassination of leading scientists and the attacks on specifically the Natanz facility. Do you feel, talking about contingency plans, if Israel doesn't feel comfortable enough, can it go ahead on a unilateral attack against Iran?
Now you've hit it. The reason why you don't go with a unilateral military attack against Iran, this high-profile attack on facilities, is because you're already attacking Iran. Let's be honest here. The Israelis are behind the assassination of Iran's leading nuclear scientist last November. November 2020. The Israelis are behind cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure with the support of the United States. So in other words, the sanctions which are already on Iran are being accompanied by pressure through Israel, but with some U.S. support, which is, look, we'll curb your nuclear program by hitting your people and by hitting your civilian infrastructure if you make moves towards any type of military program. And that's the type of action I expect to intensify if Iran steps away from the Vienna talks, which is to put more pressure on the Iranian economy, put more pressure on Iran's planning by saying, look, we're not going to hit you overtly. We can hit you in secret.
Okay. Professor Scott Lucas, always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you very much.